And I think the format is as follows. We can give you about 45 minutes for your talk, and the rest is the Q&A part. I think that we will have quite many questions. So without further ado, Ron, the floor is yours.
Okay. So, very well. It's nice to almost see you all. I really miss the old days when I would meet at the Higher School of Economics, and there's so many happy memories associated with it. I hope you're all doing well. I hope that you're taking advantage of your house arrest is sort of what it feels like. But we are making the best of it, and I have the feeling at least I can see occasional faces on the screen of old friends and colleagues, and nice to be back again. And today I'm going to talk about a book that is in progress, and in fact, it will be published in December by Oxford University Press. It'll be published under a different title, but basically the theme is Secularization Accelerates. And in this talk, I have a couple of basic points. I can tell you the story in advance. The finding is that in the last dozen years, secularization has accelerated to a surprising degree. I've published a couple of books with Pippa Norris in the past claiming that secularization was taking place, and indeed that's going on. But what is surprising is it has accelerated. In as recently as 2007, when Pippa and I last published our revised edition of Sacred and Secular, it was still true that most countries were getting more religious. And we had a reason for this. That is, we don't claim that secularization is a universal process. The sort of science steps in and everyone realizes God is dead and things like this. It's not a cognitive process. It is much more a matter of the degree to which people feel secure. And there are a number of factors involved in secularization. But the extent to which people feel that survival can be taken for granted is the biggest single factor. And this is something which is rather recent. Only since World War II has a large and growing share of the world's population begun to grow up taking survival for granted, and thus needing religion a lot less. There are a number of factors that religion serves a number of purposes. And in this book, I have an entire chapter devoted to how important religion is. In fact, the evolutionary modernization theory that I present in this book, and which I've been developing over some time, holds that anything that has become as pervasive and endured as long as religion has is serving some useful function, that it is linked with societal or individual levels survival. And so one chapter of this book goes into this in some detail, that religion has historically filled a number of important functions, one of them being explaining how the world goes, a sort of an intellectual side. It has a cosmology. But another function which tends to be underestimated, because intellectuals tend to be more interested in religion tells the creation and so on, and this is part of its function. But for most people, the most important function of religion was, in one chapter, presented this in some detail. Okay, shall I respond? Okay, I'll carry on. The most important function of religion was providing a sense of reassurance that in a very insecure world, throughout most of history, most people lived a little above starvation, and there were violence and threats to survival of all kinds, disease included. Religion served the function of providing the message that it's in the hands of a benevolent higher power, that if you follow the rules, things will work out. And this was, just had a phone call. The basic function was this enabled people to, I'll ignore the call. This basic function was it enabled people to cope with reality, cope with the challenges. Instead of panicking, instead of despair, religion gave a sense that somehow it will work out. If you follow the rules, things will work out. This was a really important function. So this is one of the functions of religion, which I think is really important and tends to be underestimated. It is religion. Okay, hi there. So, as has been pointed out, well into the 20th century, leading social thinkers held that religious beliefs would gradually disappear as scientific rationality became increasingly widespread. This was a kind of highly intellectualized version of reality that when people saw that the world was not the center of the universe, but in fact the earth revolved around the sun and things like this, they would realize that the biblical account was not scientifically accurate and dismiss it. Well, this for intellectuals was an important factor. And in fact, intellectuals did tend to become skeptical of religion, but by 1990, it was obvious religion had not disappeared. Secularization theory seemed discredited, and there was a number of things, important things, published at that time, pointing out that secularization theory was exaggerated and clearly false, and empirically is absolutely true. By my own calculations in this book that I published with Pippa Norris, we calculated that there were more people, when we published the book around 2004, our calculations were that there were more people with traditional religious beliefs in the world than ever before. It was not that secularization theory was wrong, but that secularization theory had been over-intellectualized and assumed that scientific rationality would convince people, religion, you don't need it, it's been falsified, and we have evolution instead of creationism. This clearly had not worked. And one big factor was the simple fact, which was underestimated, but if you go into it, enormously important, religion had not disappeared because religion has a tremendous connection with human fertility. And in fact, one of the basic functions, one of the basic functions of religion was to encourage people to have children. There was a whole set of morality issues linked with religion. Virtually all of the religions that became global world religions, Buddhism, Confucianism, the Orthodox version, Protestantism, Roman Catholic, all of these, in one way or another, had a set of norms encouraging women to stay at home and have many children, that this was their role, they had this specialized function, and they shouldn't try to have careers or anything like that. This is not the COVID virus, it's a chronic cough. But the idea was, first of all, women had a special role as primarily as wives and mothers, and this they should stay home and have as many children as possible, and this was rewarded psychologically and encouraged. And homosexuality or divorce or abortion or anything, any form of sex that didn't lead to procreation was discouraged as sinful and bad and should be discouraged. Sex should be devoted to having children. Well, the logic of this from the standpoint of evolutionary modernization theory is pretty clear. This is something that encourages people to have high fertility rates, and empirically there's a very strong correlation. Those regions of the world that had traditional religion persisting had much higher fertility rates than the secularized parts of the world, so that although it was true that economic development was strongly linked with secularization, and we, in this Sacred and Secular that Pippa and I published, we presented massive evidence showing, yeah, it's true. Rich countries become more secular if they are secure, if they have high levels of existential security, they do become more secular. But the joker in the pack was this led to de-emphasis of high fertility rates. And so that the world as a whole was divided into secularized countries with low fertility rates and religious countries with high fertility rates. And the fertility rates in the less developed and more traditional religious countries were so much higher that they were twice as high, maybe even more than that. And as a result, the population growth was taking place overwhelmingly in the relatively religious countries. So two things that initially seem incompatible, actually both were true. Economic development did lead to secularization. And this was, I think that the evidence in this book is pretty persuasive. It was true, high levels of economic development led to people becoming more secure, and it did lead to the scientific revolution and the scientific worldview, but more important, it led to people not needing the reassurance of religion, and so that virtually all high-income countries were secularizing, and we demonstrated with time series data that they were secularizing. So this was true, but it was also true religion had not disappeared because this crucial function it had always emphasizing having lots of children to replace the population, had resulted in the share of the births that were occurring in religious countries was way higher than the fertility rate of secular countries. So religion was not disappearing. It was, we argued that insecure people needed the predictability and absolute rules of traditional religion, and rising existential security brings declining demand for religion. But there was also this generally underestimated function, always central in terms of the mass message. Thou shalt not commit adultery, and thou shalt not do anything sexual if it doesn't lead to having children. And for women, thou shalt stay home and have kids. All of these things were very central parts of the morality, but the function of this tended to be underestimated. So insecure people need the predictability and absolute rules of traditional religion. Rising existential security brings declining demand for religion, and thus we did not attribute secularization to the advance of scientific knowledge, which the original version of secularization theory tended to attribute it to scientific rationality will sweep the world and convince people, oh, we don't really have a God up there in a white robe, and this is a myth. And actually, the myth did not die out. One reason being the strength of this message, thou shalt have all the children you can, which, in terms of evolutionary modernization theory, this fit perfectly. The reason why this set of norms, pro-fertility norms, I call them, emphasizing women have a specialized role, don't try to have careers around the world or anything, stay home and have children is part of it, and then divorce, abortion, homosexuality, masturbation, anything that did not lead to procreation was stigmatized. And this worked very well. Those societies that emphasized this set of pro-fertility norms survived. And in fact, we have historical records. Not all societies emphasized these norms. You can find all kinds of societies that didn't, but they died out. The most recent one in modern American history was the Shakers, which is a very interesting sect, which did not believe in having sex. And not too surprisingly, There are no Shakers around today. They died out over time, and there were others that one can point to. It's not that all societies emphasized pro-fertility norms, but those that had religions that emphasized pro-fertility norms were much more likely to survive and become major world religions than the ones that claimed there were even some societies that emphasized homosexuality as the dominant mode. They tended not to have many children. They tended to disappear. So in terms of understandable historical processes, we had a world evolve in which those societies that had some kind of ideology or world belief, usually religion, not always necessarily religion, but overwhelmingly, mostly religion, that emphasized pro-fertility norms and instilled them, flourished, had children, survived. The others gradually disappeared. So evolutionary modernization theory hypothesizes that secularization largely reflects rising levels of existential security. And of course, modernization, though it is linked with the spread of the scientific worldview, in terms of influencing mass behavior, secularization overwhelmingly occurs only in countries that have attained high levels of existential security, and then only after a generational timeline. There are big generational timelines involved in any major cultural change. The theory that I've been pushing for a long time is that basic values are shaped in your formative years, your pre-adult years, and then the probability, it gets lesser and lesser. You're flexible when you're young, you believe what you're told, and then by the time you reach adulthood, you have a personality that's reasonably stable and fixed. And thus, if you have been brought up in your pre-adult years with a religious outlook, you probably will have that for the rest of your life. Individuals can change, and this is not a 100% description because human beings are flexible and go all over the map. But basically, the statistical dominant tendency by far is that the values that you develop in your pre-adult years go with you and are relatively stable for the rest of your lives. So this implies secularization is not going to sweep the world automatically, as the original version, various version of secularization theory originally thought. It will only occur, it will not occur in places where the population in general has not attained high levels of existential security, and it can even move in reverse with societies that experience a massive decline in existential security, showing rising religiosity. And the most interesting case here is the ex-communist countries, Russia above all, where contrary to the secularization, the notion that secularization automatically spreads because we have modern science and all that, actually, with the collapse of communism, there was a massive revival of religion in Russia and to varying degrees other former communist countries, because the ideology that had provided a sense of meaning and purpose and which way things are going had collapsed, leaving an ideological vacuum. Communism once was a belief system that was meaningful to many people. And of course, over time, it got less persuasive, but originally, I don't think you can understand how the Bolsheviks in Russia and the Chinese communists, small minorities, overcame enormous odds and took over traditional societies. I think the ideology that gave a sense of purpose and cohesion to these movements was very important. Over time, the ideology gave way to a ruling class, the communist elite, which gave lip service to the ideology, but it was clear that it was not really motivating them. So secularization can even move in reverse with societies that experience a massive decline in existential security, which of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union for about a decade, living standards went down, life expectancy fell, income went down, social welfare institutions disappeared. Russia and, in varying degrees, other ex-communist countries were impoverished and desperate, and there was rather predictably a surge, so that one part of the world was not secularizing, it was showing rising levels of religiosity. Interestingly, that has tapered off in recent years. But for 10, 15 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, religion was expanding more in the former communist world than anywhere else. The most religious part of the world, of course, was the Islamic societies, where they have high levels of religiosity, and they're not showing much change. They have not been, by and large, though they have large oil and gas revenues, they have not modernized on this trajectory of rising education, rising occupational specialization, and so on. It has been a kind of GNP is high, but it's mainly in the hands of the ruling elite. The population at large, to varying degrees, has or has not experienced rising existential security. So, secularization, in short, is a bit more complicated than the notion we have discovered that the earth moves around the sun and that the biblical account is wrong and stuff like this. Therefore, we no longer believe. That may have persuaded scientists and intellectuals. Mass publics were not really affected by it. The big emotional drive underlying religion was, do you feel secure that survival, if survival seems threatened, one option to function, to have faith and go ahead with doing what you can, even in the face of an uncertain future. Religion was very good at providing that. So now here is the message: things have changed. The book that I published with Pippa Norris, Sacred and Secular, originally 2004, new edition 2011, is outdated in one important way. The story told in that book went up through the World Values Surveys through 2007. And secularization has accelerated in much of the world since that. This 2007 is not that long ago, but big changes have occurred. And the two major factors underlying secularization are the long-term factor that we've been talking about all along, rising existential security. That we have, that continues on. It's a long-term gradual process, largely intergenerational population replacement. People who are raised under the new conditions, when they become adults, when they become part of the adult population with a 20, 25-year time lag, then that changes the composition of the adult population. But there's this big time lag. It is not that you get developed in year X, and in year X plus 1, you're secular. Not at all, totally unrealistic. Mostly, secularization occurs as younger generation that have been raised under conditions of high existential security. When they become adults, the adult population begins to gradually, with population replacement, become more secular. And that's something that is documented already. The big rapid change now is a massive shift from pro-fertility norms to individual choice norms. Again, this has been the basic shift from norms has been gradual, based on intergenerational population replacement, and I'll give some evidence of this. People have been growing up with younger generations much less attached to pro-fertility norms, much more likely to emphasize the opposite, that is, individual choice norms. And this has itself been a gradual process, but recently it's come to a turning point. This turning point is one where the balance shifts. There's a tipping point where throughout history, the normal worldview almost everywhere in major societies has been pro-fertility norms. Gender roles, very specialized for women. Your function is to stay home and have kids, and don't forget it. And divorce, abortion, homosexuality, anything that is not linked with creation is de-emphasized. These were the normal, self-respecting, decent people's norms throughout most of history, but recently, we have reached a tipping point where the dominant opinion in advanced industrial societies has shifted from pro-fertility norms to individual choice norms, which emphasize gender equality. And I assume that a number of the people in the audience are women, and I would say this is a good thing for you in particular, probably a good thing for all of us. The gender equality has shifted from becoming a sort of lunatic fringe position to the dominant position where Donald Trump has not quite got there yet, but most of society thinks women are just as smart as men and should have the same rights and opportunities and so on. And this has been a gradual process to now, among the younger and better educated segments of society, this is overwhelming. Some of the sexist comments that were once normal and which are still normal for Donald Trump are shocking and are unacceptable. And this is a big shift. It's been a tipping point. And this is a one-off thing. This throughout, I would say, this is a simplification, but throughout recorded history, pro-fertility norms have been the respectable, dominant, socially desirable norms. That has changed within recent years, within the last 20, 30 years. And of course, it changes at different rates. The younger, better educated segments of the population were at the avant-garde of this, and older, less educated have not got there yet. But the dominant opinion has been shifting. We've reached a tipping point from pro-fertility norms being the respectable, dominant, socially desirable norms to individual choice norms being the dominant, normal, socially acceptable norms. Okay, now here is the big finding. This, if you see nothing else in this presentation, this one you should remember, and I made it up in big, plain figures because it's a great big change. This is one of the reasons why I have written a new book, though the book with Pippa, I think, was a splendid book. You all should read it, of course, but it's outdated in one important way. Our time series ended on these two graphs on the left. This shows percentage of countries. We've got 49 countries. There are two that were no change. So 49 countries we analyzed where we had, these 49 countries were countries where we had a substantial time series in 2007 when our analysis was based on. And at that point, as we showed, 33 of these 49 countries had shown an increase in religiosity over the time series that we had. This is from 1981 to 2007, fairly recent time series. At that point, the world was getting more religious, or let's say this is one indicator that it was true. The world as a whole was getting more religious. And 14 countries, however, there had been an oversimplified claim at that point that there was a global rebirth of religion in the world as a whole. That was not true of the world as a whole. The high-income countries in particular, and some others, but particularly the high-income countries for which we had time series evidence, and these 49 countries included 60% of the world's population. It was not a tiny sample at all. It was most of the world. The World Values Survey has not been able to carry out survey after survey after survey in every country in the world, but we have been able to do it in countries containing most of the world's population. And as of 2007, the finding was, as had been claimed by some, most of the world was getting more religious. This reflected in large part, and of course, it's never one factor, but in large part, this reflected the fact that low-income countries that were religious had much higher fertility rates, or birth rates, than the secular advanced high-income countries. And the high-income countries were already barely replacing or below the population replacement level. So in terms of this, the logic of the traditional emphasis on fertility norms was working. The world as a whole was becoming more religious as recently as 2007. We now have data from 2007 to 2020, and analyzing these most recent data, we find a shocking, quite surprisingly large shift. It's not that it's shocking in the sense that it's theoretically incomprehensible. In fact, it's what the theory implies. But the size of the shift has been remarkable, and it's sudden. So the finding here is there's been a sudden increase in secularization, so that among these same 49 countries, and again, no change in one, so we just show the 6 became more religious. 42 became less religious from 2007 to 2020, about a dozen-year period, and it's a very big contrast. So this is a finding which I think is worth remembering, and if you forget everything else I've said, I would say this is the biggest single finding. We'll go into the details and explain why, but this is sort of sums up this big picture that virtually all world religions instilled pro-fertility norms, which were needed for societies to survive under conditions of high infant mortality and low life expectancy. I would emphasize it was not a sort of queer whim that motivated all world religions to emphasize this. It was that unless you emphasize these norms, your society tended to die out. You needed to have high fertility, and societies that continue to survive did encourage it very firmly. God told you, thou shalt do this. They didn't just say, we think it'd be nice if you would do this. Under pain of hellfire and very severe sanctions, you must do these things which lead to high fertility. These norms, however, one reason why they were so firmly exhorted, and the threats of damnation, hellfire, and so on, and going blind and all kinds of things that were supplemented them for children. These norms require people to suppress strong. Hi there. Okay. These norms require people to suppress strong natural urges. Thou shalt not commit adultery is firmly in the Christian tradition, and it is emphasized strongly because people have a strong desire to commit adultery. Let's say free sex is appealing to many people. Certainly we are all respectable people, so none of us, but most people would like to commit adultery if they could get away with it. They were firmly discouraged from it because this tended to break up the family, and if you didn't know who the father was, the child might not survive, and so on. These norms, and of course, the stigma attached to homosexuality, the requiring women to stay home and not have careers, and women actually do have minds of their own and would like to become social scientists, the most wonderful career available, some would say. These norms require suppressing strong natural urges. If you are gay, it requires self-hatred, repression. This is not easy. And once these norms are no longer needed, there is indeed a strong psychological pressure to do away with them. It is not that we naturally conform to pro-fertility norms, they actually require a lot of suppression and self-control. And once they're no longer needed for survival, there is indeed a motivation to do away with them, but they don't disappear overnight. This is a measure, I've been talking about pro-fertility norms versus individual choice norms, and I measure them with a set of 6 items from the World Values Survey. And here are the factor loadings. They all tap a fairly strongly clear underlying dimension, which I have described as pro-fertility. And all of these are worded in the pro-fertility fashion. That is, pro-fertility norms hold that. Homosexuality is never justifiable. Men have more right to a job than women. Divorce is never justifiable. Men make better political leaders than women. Abortion is never justifiable. University education is more important for a boy than for a girl. All of these are the pro-fertility version. The opposite, which is an option in each of these questions, is homosexuality is okay. Men don't have more right to a job than women. Divorce is okay. Women are as good as political leadership as men, so on. The world is open to men and women, and a set of norms governing sexual behavior can either be emphasized in the pro-fertility direction or individual choice. And the individual choice option requires less self-hatred, repression, and so there's motivation to do away with it, which was why religion traditionally very firmly, with all kinds of dreadful threats, emphasized the pro-fertility version. Well, here's another indication of something that I've already mentioned. That is, secularization is occurring. This is a cohort analysis breaking down among all countries for which you have a significant time series. This is 32 high-income countries. It's all the high-income countries. Because this is a cross-sectional analysis. The message here is very simple. Older birth cohorts emphasize God a lot more than younger birth cohorts. Among the oldest birth cohort for which we have data, they are mostly dead by now, but, well, actually, I would say they're probably all dead. The birth cohort, but our time series goes back, we have data from 1981 on. The oldest cohort had about 42% saying God is very important in their lives. And this is 0.1 on a 10-point scale, ranging from very important to not important. 40-some% were at the extreme, very important position on this scale in the old days. As you move from older to younger birth cohorts, those born in 1904 to 1913, and 1914 to 1923, and so on down to those born from 1994 to 2003, there's a huge change. Huge generational change in the importance of God in one's life, from 42% taking the extreme, very important position to only about 10% roughly of this younger birth cohort. Tremendous change. This, of course, does not bring overnight change in religiosity. But as the young replace the old, you do see declining emphasis on religion. And here's a birth cohort analysis saying they do not believe in God. And this used to be an item which practically everyone would say they believe in God. In terms of in 1981, the oldest cohort, about 9% said they do not believe in God in high-income countries. This has gone changing with intergenerational replacement to the point where among the youngest cohort, 52% of the population in 14 high-income countries say they do not believe in God. This is a statement that once would have branded you as an atheist outcast once, Now it's become, for the youngest cohort, the majority position in high-income countries. So very big change in religiosity occurring. And it's, in the United States, very steep. I show the US separately because the US was the poster child of rich countries that were still highly religious. In fact, many proponents of religiosity claimed secularization was a myth, not occurring, and they point to the US as the case proving very modern, very rich countries can be very religious, and that was still true until fairly recently. Since in the 21st century, we see a surging rise of atheism or non-belief in God, even in the US, so that throughout most of time, tiny minority of US population would say they don't believe in God. As of the most recent survey in the US, 32% of the youngest cohort were saying they don't believe in God. This is not quite the majority position that we find in other high-income countries, but the change is very strong. Even the US is changing very rapidly in recent years. It's a recent change. And this reflects one of the driving forces, I claim, is that this is partly motivated, and an important part of it. The story is more complicated than one factor. And since you're also a scientist, I think you would find it highly unlikely that a major change, such as from a religious worldview to a secular worldview, could be explained by one simple factor. It's not, but this is a big part of it. Changing support for individual choice norms. This is these 6 items about university education more important for a boy than for a girl, men have more right to a job, homosexuality never justifiable. That set of norms. Big, big change. This is change in support for individual choice norms from 1981 to 2020. In a pooled sample of data from 14 high-income countries, for which we have time series data from 1981 to actually, in some cases, 2020, but it's about 2018. The simple, I won't try to explain the scale. These are these are based on the distribution in the pooled sample as a whole, with the 0 point being the median. And basically, I won't go into all those details. You can see the change is really huge. From a very small share supporting individual choice norms to a large, to generally majority support for individual choice norms. This is linked to the religiosity. And in fact, this diagram, which is complicated, and I would take a half hour to explain it in complete detail, but let's say. The basic point is religiosity is strongly linked with support for individual choice norms. Theoretically, this is no surprise. Religion has implanted individual choice norms and supported them. And the two tend to go together. And from upper left, we find countries that are high, very high percentage say God is important in their lives. And they are emphasizing pro-fertility norms: Zimbabwe, Libya, Indonesia, Ghana, Morocco, Bangladesh, etc. In the lower right-hand corner, we have countries that are very low on the importance of God in their lives and overwhelmingly support individual choice norms. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands being the avant-garde in this. And although China is an interesting deviant case, in Vietnam and Thailand to some degree, China has traditionally been secular. So though the relationship here is individual choice norms were not imposed by religion in China, but traditionally was relatively secular. So it's a different route, but overall the picture is very strong. Correlation is 0.77. Religiosity goes with high fertility, pro-fertility norms. Secularism goes with individual choice norms. And this is the high-income countries overwhelmingly are in the camp of relatively low religiosity and support for individual choice norms. And the dynamic is important. And this is a complicated matter. Sorry for that. Social change is sometimes a bit complicated. In fact, it nearly always is complicated. But basically, what's going on here is the historic, there's a strong correlation, no question about that. I would say that's an empirical fact. What's causing what is more complex because it's a reciprocal causation in which historically causality overwhelmingly was religion imposing pro-fertility norms. But it's reciprocal. There's always been a sort of feedback with desire to not have pro-fertility norms tending to undermine religion, but religion was winning the dominant influence overwhelmingly. Recently, I claim, the world has reached a tipping point where the majority in these countries, Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, the high-income countries, majority opinion favors individual choice norms. And this is driving the causality in the other direction. There's always been a tension, but now predominant thrust is rising individual choice norms are driving secularization. And here is this tipping point that I talked about. And since I was told I should only talk for 45 minutes and I've talked for 50 minutes, I guess I'd better knock off at this point and allow questions and cries of outrage or anything else. This is an analysis of changes over time. And this is basically, I only show 9 countries on this because showing all high-income countries would be a spaghetti mass, an unreadable graph. But I show 9 countries in which all of them start out around 1981 at the left of the graph. All of them were below the midpoint of the scale. That is, most opinion in every country, even in Sweden, at this 1981 time point, were below the midpoint, which can be interpreted as, since this is a weighted scale of individual choice, the midpoint is the tipping point, where above the midpoint, predominant opinion is for individual choice norms. Below the midpoint, predominant choice, predominant public support is for pro-fertility norms. In 1981, all of these societies, and it's in fact all societies in the world at that point, but all of these societies too, emphasized, predominant opinion emphasized pro-fertility norms. Sweden and Finland were among the first countries to cross. By 1990, Finland had crossed the tipping point. It fell back and then went up above it again from then on. Sweden crossed about 1990 and went more and more to the point where it's overwhelmingly, the Swedish public overwhelmingly is supporting pro-choice norms, individual choice norms. And by and large, one country after the other has been moving above the midpoint on the scale. The US only about 2011. And the US is one of the most recent. We do have data for Japan now, and Japan is above the midpoint of the scale. All of these countries in recent years have moved from predominant opinion supporting pro-fertility norms to predominant opinion supporting individual choice norms. And I claim, and if you read this book, you'll, I'm sure, be convinced, the evidence is quite massive. This is only one of the, it was a big factor, an underestimated factor. One of the big factors driving secularization has been this tipping point where suddenly support for gender equality, tolerance of gays and lesbians, acceptance of abortion, divorce, a whole set of norms linked with individual choice have become predominant, especially among the younger, better educated segments of these populations, But this tipping point suddenly has shifted the balance where conformism has changed camps. And now the post-conformism and social desirability effects favor individual choice norms, and because these are closely linked with religion, are pushing against religiosity. And this is one of the factors. There are other factors too, which I'll just mention in passing. One of them is terrorism has been linked with religiosity, and terrorism is very unpopular, even in Muslim majority countries. Terrorism tends to inflict victims, above all in Muslim majority countries, and that's one factor. And basically, there's the Roman Catholic history of child abuse and stuff, which is undermined in Catholic countries, the authority of the church. There are other factors too. I would be crazy to say this is the whole story, but a big part of the story is the shift from pro-fertility norms to individual choice norms, which recently has crossed this tipping point and now is favoring views that it once opposed. Conformism now is in favor in these countries, among the young and the better educated particularly, of gender equality and tolerance of gays and a whole set of norms which are causing a big reaction. The Trump phenomenon in the United States, the alternative for Germany, right-wing phenomenon around the world are reacting to this tipping point where things are moving in a direction where people with traditional values feel correctly that some of their most cherished basic values are eroding rapidly. So at this point, thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry to have overrun my time, but I open the floor for anyone who wants to raise a question or a comment.
Ron, thank you. Thanks a lot. And so now we may open the floor for discussion, for questions and answers. So please, who wants to start?
If I could.
Yes, yes, Edward, of course.
Yes, thank you, Ron, for your presentation. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Ed.
So the premise here is that existential security leads to proliferation of individual choice norms and hence to lower levels of religiosity. What do you make of the current crisis associated with, there's a somebody else is speaking through the mic, and I would
I can hear you
very much if people turned off the mic. So what do you make of the current crisis? Part of it is temporary, associated with COVID, but the consequences are very serious.
They're very serious.
The number of unemployed people and so on. So all this, and there is reason to believe there may be also, long-term financial consequences. And given this, the existential security will likely deteriorate in many countries in the foreseeable future, at least for some time. So how do you...
Your logic is perfectly clear, Ed. I have claimed all along rising existential security is conducive to secularization, and conversely, declining existential security is conducive to religiosity. We saw that in Russia with the collapse of communism. There was a decade of insecurity, and until about 2000, religion was flourishing, spreading in Russia. The logic is clear. The coronavirus pandemic undermines existential security. It kills people, which is very much undermining existential security. The impact, of course, has to be interpreted in terms of the generational population replacement mechanism, There are actually two factors. There is a short-term effect, sort of the period effect, and there's the generational replacement effect. The long-term effect is the more lasting. So basically, in answer to your question, I would say clearly the short-term effect of this is to undermine existential security and support for secular viewpoints and individual choice norms, but it depends on how long the effects are. You do not change a culture in 6 months. This is something which the empirical research that we've done for 40 years now shows basic values change with intergenerational population replacement. What future I would forecast would require me to know how long we're going to have the coronavirus crisis. One optimistic interpretation is not much longer. Let's say I will give the most optimistic possible. There are some comments about progress being made in a vaccine that will immunize you from the COVID virus as soon within this year. By December of this year, we might, I don't promise a thing, we might have an effective vaccine to stop the COVID crisis, in which case this will be seen as a very severe, extremely severe, but short-term event. This would not be enough to reverse the basic trends. However, let's go to the other extreme. There are people who say that the economy of most countries has been badly damaged and will be, for decades to come, will not recover. The COVID crisis could trigger a Great Depression. Already we have unemployment levels in the US similar to those in the Great Depression, very serious. How long this endures is a big question. One reading of the future, that this will reverse the gains of the past decades and usher in a new era similar to the Great Depression of the 1930s, in which case, I don't like it, but the logic is that these cultural changes I've been studying will go in reverse. So I don't claim that God has said that the rise of individual choice norms will take place. This is something contingent on what happens. I am guardedly optimistic. I think we probably will come up with an effective vaccine. When that happens, the economies will probably retire, will probably regain their expansionism. Prosperity probably will return, but I can't promise the future. So the logic of Ed's question is clear. We could face a reversal, the decline of all these cultural changes of the past, more or less since the 1950s. But I think it is contingent on how bad this crisis is. I am guardedly optimistic, but I can't promise a thing.
Well, thank you.
Okay, who's next? Okay, may I intervene as a follow-up question? To what extent, how do you think the change in religiosity due to the current crisis might happen or not happen because of the fact that there might be some room for many actors to be more effective? I mean, so many people require aid either from the state, either from NGOs, to give them, let's say, food, basic services, and also religious authorities, let's say like this, may be in some cases quite effective, or in some cases quite ineffective, providing this aid, assistance to people who urgently need this aid. And to what extent, I mean, any change in religiosity might be explained by their, change in, let's say, popular respect or disrespect to religious authorities, religious organizations, not, the individual level. So will they start believing in God or not, but changing their attitudes to the church as an organization, which may be quite effective in providing some basic services that people urgently need now.
Andrey, you raise a very important point. I've been talking about broad patterns of social dynamism linked with economic development and social change. The broad patterns are not the whole story. Individual actors like Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump also matter. They make predictions much more difficult. We can, in terms of things linked with economic development, we can make broad, roughly, fairly reliable predictions. Predicting the next Donald Trump is very, very hard. Individuals do matter. They make social science much less deterministic. You can never predict 100% the future. I would say it is clear Donald Trump has done his best to exacerbate paranoia and xenophobia in the United States, and his appeal to the anxieties of the traditional part of the population. It's still a large share of the US population, less than half, but still a large share of the US population. And he has succeeded in mobilizing their fears and anxieties and to build a wall to keep out these dangerous rapists and murderers from Mexico, which grotesque caricature of reality, but scared, frightened people can be frightened. Vladimir Putin has done, he's, I would say, a much more clever person. He has impulse control, unlike Donald Trump, but individuals can manipulate what happens. There's no doubt about it. Usually social science predictions are based on the behavior of masses and economies and so on, because those are relatively predictable. But as Andrey has pointed out, there are ways that the internet can be manipulated to rouse fears and anxieties, and that the behavior, I cannot, to be perfectly frank, I can't predict what will happen in terms of who will be the next president of the United States. That's something in the near future about which I have fervent cares, but I'm not sure what's going to happen. And what happens if Donald Trump gets another term, I think could be pervasively negative and could tend to erode the trends that I have studied so far. However, let's say, I can make one fairly confident statement. In the long run, people have tended to get more secure. This is linked with technological progress. Technological progress tends to raise general income levels, minimize starvation, tends to expand life expectancy. There are a number of things. There are broad trends linked with modernization, which, though individuals or wars or crises or the coronavirus can affect also, I would say that the long-term trend certainly, I think incontrovertibly, has been toward rising prosperity, toward rising life expectancy and so on. Those trends, I would argue, go with the shift from pro-fertility norms to individual choice norms, and from highly religious to relatively secular trends. So other things being equal, I think in the long haul, this trend is likely to dominate. Technology tends to make life more secure, in a nutshell. This, I can't guarantee a thing about the future, and this is a sort of a probabilistic prediction, but I'd say there's a lot of historical evidence indicating that life expectancies have gotten higher for sure in most countries, not every country, but in nearly all countries. Life expectancy has gotten bigger. Infant mortality has demonstrably gotten much smaller. Some of the factors that are relevant to what kind of world we live in. Do we need pro-fertility norms as much as we used to? I would say no. Do we need religion as much as we used to? No. By the way, the final chapters of the book emphasize religion has served a very important function throughout history. People need a belief system. I don't think that that will disappear. And the final chapters of this book explore what is likely, what is coming, what is likely to come next if religiosity is declining. Is my time up?
No.
Okay.
Okay. So I see a question from Kirill in the chat. So Kirill, would you like to speak?
Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, no, because now I am on the working place. Cause of it, I write my question on the chat. I'm sorry.
I can read his question out if you want. So his question is about the changes of religiosity in Russia and other post-socialist countries. He notices the decline of real religiosity. That is, people say that they are, believers, but visit church only twice a year. That's in Russia in between 1990 and 2010. And the question is, do you think this problem is relevant in the current religious studies in Europe?
Well, in one bit of information that I do have definite information on is from 1990 particularly, to 2007, Russia and in general, the ex-communist countries became dramatically more religious. Much of the world, the high-income countries, all were becoming more secular. The ex-Soviet Empire was for a decade and more becoming dramatically more religious. That trend has reversed itself. Most of these countries, including Russia, is a little, is still relatively religious, more religious than France, for example, but the trend has died off. This surge of religiosity in the ex-communist world subsided to a large degree. Have I answered your question? I don't think I have. Ed, would you add anything to that question?
No, thank
Okay.
you.
Any other questions, please?
May I?
Oh, Anna, please.
Anna?
Yeah, hi Ron, thanks a lot. That was very inspiring for me. What I'm thinking about is that, to my mind, churches and religious organizations of all kinds may have had so diverse responses towards the current pandemic. And since so many, well, quite many people are still following religious organizations closely, that has had a profound effect on how people think about, how people react, how they behave under current conditions of lockdown. So could you please tell us a little bit about the reaction of organizations of religious kind in the United States? How did they respond? Did they cooperate with the government? Did they cooperate with the medical care organizations? I mean, do they work together to overcome the crisis, or is it like everyone is pulling trying to gain more importance and push their line here?
In the US, there's very great religious diversity, as you know. And one of the generalizations, so I could say they're going in all directions because there are many different ones, but one broad generalization is, and this is sad to see, in the Vietnam era, many religious organizations were taking progressive stands and opposing the war, and generally were on the left. In recent years, the fundamentalist versions of religion, which are a big part of the whole in the US, have rallied behind Donald Trump. He is not exactly a model of moral and upright conduct, and he is a habitual liar and so on. I could go on in some detail about why I find this not obvious, but the reality is fundamentalist leaders have rallied behind Donald Trump and have been backing him almost unconditionally. I would say, and there's evidence, this is costing them more than they realize. It is discrediting them on the younger generation. This is one of the additional factors in the US, and I think this tends to be true in Western Europe also. Religion has been co-opted by a kind of reaction, a fundamentalist reaction, which in the short term in the US is in power, in the short term has had big impact in Germany and France and in Britain in different ways. But of course, this has been criticized by minorities, by less fundamentalist, more progressive religious leaders, have been shocked and very critical of this, and pointing out that this is discrediting them and undermining their future, because demonstrably, younger, better educated, more liberal people are leaving the church because of this. So it's cutting its own future for an alliance with a currently powerful reaction.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think there are some parallels all over the world here. So according to you, then we're going to have some consequences later on in a couple of decades when those young people grow up with this kind of experience behind them.
Yes, that tends to be underestimated. But politicians don't necessarily think about the next generation.
Thank you, Anna. Anyone else? Questions, comments? Okay. Questions, comments?
Yeah, can I?
Yes, of course.
Hey, Ron. Greetings
Hi.
from Germany. Thanks for your very interesting talk. I would like to come back to the high religiosity rates in the Arabic world. It's also including in very rich countries. I think this is somewhat interesting that a lot of people grow up there in very good circumstances, and nevertheless, there's not this secularization process. And even if we see high levels of female education in these countries, and also more empowering conditions and changes here, it's relatively stable. And for this reason, I was wondering if we could say that maybe the society then thinks that this religiosity combined with this wealth has maybe an evolutionary advantage for the own society, which is the reason why it is so legitimate in the society itself. Whereas in our societies, in comparison, we avoid to be religious because we know that this is not in our advantage. In our case, it's good when women and men go to work and be productive. And this is the way how we create our wealth and are more efficient and more powerful as a society. And for that reason, we give more priority to individual norms and choices. whereas in other societies, they can guarantee a certain level in other ways. And for this reason, they can give more legitimacy then to this other norms as well. What do you think here? What is the really the mechanism here behind?
It's a very important distinctive area. I haven't really talked about the Muslim majority part of the world, but it's quite distinct. It is not becoming more religious. It is becoming more active, and one hears more from it. But actually, the population is not becoming more religious. They already were at the high end of the scale. There wasn't much room for further religiosity. It's stable and not showing significant decline of religion. So this is unlike most of the world. The Muslim cultural zone is remaining highly religious, remaining very strong in emphasis on pro-fertility norms. And this is an understandable exception. It is not modernized. It's a part of the world that has not gone through the main sequence of modernization of rising industrialization, occupational specialization, rising education, rising all kinds of changes. It has become superficially rich by having large oil and gas reserves that they sell to foreigners. And even the people extracting them are in large part foreigners. This is very important. They are, some of these countries, of course, some of them are dirt poor, but some of them are very rich. And this sets an example of countries that have traditional elites in control of large amounts of money, which gives them the trappings of modernization. They have modern medical care, air conditioning, they're dry, they can buy modern military equipment. They have a traditional elite in possession of the trappings of modernization, not because of this main sequence of economic development, but of a rather not at all deep-rooted economic development based on oil and gas reserves, which one important consequence is these traditional elites have prestige. Without this, they would look backward and impoverished and weak. And in fact, they play an important role in the world. They have relatively strong military forces. And these traditional elites have a huge incentive in maintaining that their rule is justified by traditional religious norms. And insofar as they seem to be successful, this gives them a new lease on life. I think this is not the main sequence of development, and that more or less medieval absolute monarchies in the modern era, it's interesting to see that they do survive. And I think the reasoning is relatively, they don't have deep roots. This prosperity is not widely shared, although some regimes do, in fact, have widespread, spread the wealth around, but mostly it is not a deep-rooted, widely based kind of modernization. It is due to the importance of petroleum in the second half of the 20th century, it has become an alternate route to becoming rich, having modern arms and air conditioning and medical care, without cultural modernization. Europe and the world, including China and India, the world as a whole does not have this option. To become rich, they had to modernize. They had to industrialize, get mass education, and so on. And this brings deep-rooted social changes. Part of the world still has a medieval political, cultural superstructure made possible because there's an alternative route to getting rich if you have big oil reserves.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? We have a few minutes left. the last chance. Okay, so if not, I would like to thank Ron for giving his talk. So it was a very big pleasure to see you.
And I'd like to say it was a great pleasure to see my old friends. I saw several of you on the video. Those were the good old days. I hope we meet together face to face before too long.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.